Hi, I'm John Nash, and welcome to Cafe UCEA. 20 years ago, in 1996, the Council of Chief State School Officers published the first standards for educational leaders via the Interstate School Leadership Licensure Consortium, better known as ISLLC. Since that time, the ISLLC standards have been subject to revision and modification, with a major update in 2008. But in 2015, they were revised again and renamed. They're now referred to as the Professional Standards for Educational Leaders, or PSEL. Now, these standards have been a fixture in the field, particularly for those who concern themselves with the training and development of school leaders. They've been the guiding principles for what leaders are expected to know and do. So the question is, why new standards now? Do they go far enough in setting the standard for how we should be leading schools, and what still remains to be addressed? We're going to spend the next 30 minutes trying to unpack some of this, and you can participate by getting on to Google+. At the bottom right of the video window, click Ask a New Question, and then type your question and click Submit. We'll do the best we can to answer it during the show. My guests today are Dr. Beverly Hutton, Deputy Executive Director of NASSP's Programs and Services, and Dr. Mark Smylie, Professor Emeritus of Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Beverly, welcome to Cafe UCEA.
Thank you for having me, John. It's my pleasure to be here.
Mark, thanks for being on Cafe UCEA.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Mark, I'd like to start with you. Why new standards now?
Well, the short answer to that is that things change. And if professional standards are to continue to be relevant and an efficacious instrument for guiding the practice of educational leaders, the standards themselves need to change accordingly. You mentioned that standards for school leaders are now 20 years old, and a lot has happened in that this last 20 years. The nature and function of education is changing. The nature and work of educational leaders have changed. There's been substantial growth in the knowledge about effective schools and effective leadership that's occurred over these last 2 decades. And we've become a lot better about thinking about the demands of leadership into the future. We've also learned a little bit from our experience in working with the ISLLC standards about the role of standards in the development of policy related to the support and the development of the profession. So with all this, the development of this new understanding, the changing nature of education and the work of educational leaders, the time seemed about right in 2013 to begin the process of looking closely at the ISLLC standards and preparing to change them accordingly.
So, Beverly, what's new in the standards that wasn't there before? Are these vastly different, or are we looking at sort of just a small little refresh?
It's not a small refresh. It's more of an elaboration and an elevation of some areas of practice. The standards definitely reflect principal practice. In fact, we recently had at our national conference, there were a few sessions on the standards, one of which I presented to our state affiliates, our state affiliate directors, if you will. And the feedback was very positive, and interestingly, the discussions began to focus on what skills and dispositions are necessary to implement these standards with fidelity. Because principals are required through these standards to promote social and emotional learning in support of each student, the necessity here is to understand yourself better, therefore causing us to be not only reflective, but introspective. So issues came up in our discussions, in the presentations around social emotional learning and the importance of personal well-being, personal intelligence, and reasoning about ourselves and others. People started to talk about implicit biases and the fact that we do need to be more reflective and introspective, and also mindfulness. Maintaining a non-judgmental state. So this came as a natural progression of the discussion in response to the standards. In particular, the standard on Standard 3 on equity and cultural responsiveness, and it specifically mentions confronting and altering institutional biases. So this is going beyond this notion of tolerance or diversity training or sensitivity training, and this is about cultural competence and responsiveness and the acceptance of each student and the family that they represent. I think this is about celebrating what students are bringing to the learning environment, not imposing any explicit or implicit bias on them. So we here at NASSP, we're discussing how we can partner with others who are experts on these topics to help us craft and offer professional development opportunities to our members and constituents to help them implement these standards with fidelity so that all schooling experiences can be positive for the entire school community and all of the respective constituents, students, teachers, and families. So it's not new, but it's just an elaboration of those topics that are top of mind in the principal leadership experience right now.
That new standard, number 3, or is it fair to say that's new, number 3?
It is new. Yeah. It is new and was quite a topic of discussion and conversation as we got into this 3rd iteration of the standards, because this is what principals are dealing with. We had practitioners on the committee that Mark and I shared that came up with this 3rd iteration, and the feedback that we were getting from the field as well as the practitioners who were present talked about that this issue of cultural responsiveness and equity is something that they deal with, not only with because the demographic of students are changing, the demographic of the country is changing, etc., and they need to be competently dealing with that.
From your standpoint, Mark, what's new in the standards that wasn't there before?
I think the way that Bev is framing this is a good way, that we should think about this set of standards really as building upon a pretty firm foundation of the ISLLC standards. At the same time, this new set of standards, and Bev's talking about this notion of elaboration, extension, and elevation of certain key themes. So, for example, the focus of the 3rd standard on equity and cultural responsiveness was embedded in the ISLLC standards, but done so in a way that it named it, but gave rather short shrift to it. It's a very good example of an area of school leaders' work that is elevated in response to changes over the last 20 years and in anticipation of changes in the nature and the demographics of schooling going forward. I think there's some other themes that are elevated and elaborated as well that are particularly important. I think a couple of themes are this important relationship in the education of children between press and academic rigor and the creating the communities of care and support for students. Now, both those ideas were contained in the earlier set of standards, but they're elaborated more substantially now to reflect the knowledge that we've gained over the last 20 years about their importance. And in some ways, the emphasis on care and support and the development of communities for kids, communities for the professional adults who work in the school, even communities of engagement for parents and families, help to give due attention to the other side of the equation, that the other side being accountability and press. Just a couple of other things too here that are important. The emphasis on ethics was also important to elevate, and one more just as an example here, or actually 2 more I think that are important, is the importance of developing the capacity of professional staff and the working conditions for them to act upon that capacity in the service of children is huge. And then leadership for school improvement. Looking forward, it's hard to imagine the role of a school leader not involving continuous examination of how things are going for kids, the organizational state of the school and engaging in appropriate improvement activity along the way. So those are a number of areas that are elevated and highlighted more. Just one other thing about that, then in the process of elaborating and elevating came an effort to better articulate and clarify particularly important concepts. So you'll note that while all of these were present, they were sometimes conflated and entangled with other ideas in the older set of standards. Now they're much more straightforward and hopefully more understandable and easier to act upon.
Can you give an example of some of the things that were conflated that now seem to be teased out a little more clearly?
Well, for example, I'll go back to the important theme of the relationship between press and support in the standard. Those two were together, packed pretty densely together in a single standard in the 1996 and the 2008 version, to the extent that it was a little difficult to understand what was being meant. And clearly the nuances of those dimensions of school leaders' work, it was very difficult to articulate those. So that's just one example of pulling it apart a bit and being much more explicit about what those elements of school leaders' work might mean.
Yeah, I think the emphasis on community too, Mark, the fact that we teased out community for faculty and staff, and then community of care for students, and then this whole emphasis on family. And when we looked at the 6 ISLLC standards, and now we have 10 PSEL 2015 standards, you can see a more emphasis on this whole thing around community. I think that was, well, we know, Mark, as we worked on them together, that was very deliberate.
Yeah, and I think in relation to that, thanks, Bev. That was a good point. There are a couple of other things that are highlighted, even more so, I think. One is the attention. You'll see it in every single standard of the relationship between that domain of leaders' work and the success of students in school. And not just students abstractly, but the language is very intentional. The success of each student in school, which relates, I think, quite well to standard number 3 again. But there's another important dimension to that, is that in each of the standards it speaks to the academic success of students, but also to the development of broader well-being for each student, which would incorporate a broader range of valued outcomes of schooling along social, emotional, psychological development of children that can get short shrift when all we are paying attention to is academic achievement and test scores.
Right.
I think perhaps the last thing I'll mention that has been put right out front on this set of standards is the systemic nature of school leaders' work, and therefore the systemic nature of the standards themselves. They're meant to be read as a whole, rather than pick one here, 2 here, that sort of thing. They try to portray with as much accuracy as possible the holistic nature of school leaders' work. That doesn't mean necessarily that every standard has to be paid attention to equally at all times, but it means that in the exercise of professional discretion, in response to situation and contingency, that the different elements of these standards might be emphasized at different times and in different places.
Yeah, there's a real interdependency there.
Yeah.
A real interdependency that was deliberate, I would say, as well.
So, John, those are, I think, between Bev's comments and mine, these are good examples of ways that this newest reiteration of the standards has a foot in the old standards, but elevates, elaborates, and extends some of the really key ideas into our newer understanding of educational leadership and the projection of that understanding into the future.
This notion of being more explicit around matters of equity, and also something that struck me, the word each in each student. Seems as though there's been some deliberation around trying to lift up the individual needs of students across the spectrum of schooling. This feels a little, it's a little trite maybe, but I mean, it feels a little courageous to say the word each. Was the word each student, was there some deliberation there that went on? Because I think it's really putting a lot, I think deservedly so, on the shoulders of the leaders to think about all their students and their individual needs. But I think seeing that in a standard seems intriguing to me.
Hey Mark, let me take it, and then you can take it and finish it. But yes, there was a great deal of deliberation around the word each. And discussion of should it be every, should it be all?
Right, because you think like all kids.
Right.
Oh, we're going to help all kids.
Exactly. And we wanted it to be pointed and directed so that it wouldn't get thrown in this big basket of all of them. But when you say each, you have to look at every single student and what their needs are. And then there was also a deliberate focus on students with special needs, to make sure that each and every student was known and valued and represented in this particular body of work. Mark, you want to pick it up?
I think you summarized it very well. I mean, now what that means and how it plays out in the day in and day life of schools is something to consider. That, for example, one could argue that the standards demand that every child should be known by some adult in the building, and that perhaps not the principal, but it's up to the principal to ensure that every child is known by some adult in the building. And so, Bev, your emphasis on, or your description of the emphasis on each child as a way to make sure that no child is overlooked or forgotten, or children are not lumped together, and what we think about are dealing in categories of kids, that we don't objectify, and we don't inappropriately and unproductively think about children in groups, is very important here. Not that demographics and groups and context don't matter, but it's a way to humanize and to personalize in ways that are consistent with the creation of communities, of belongingness, of investment, of engagement, and in personal success and well-being.
I think it's also fair to say, Mark, under the leadership team that helped to construct or write the standards, that was never a point of contention. Once it was explained very easily, everyone was unanimously, you're absolutely right, this is the direction we need to go in. And I think you're also right, John, when you say it was a courageous move, because it was intentionally courageous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is Cafe UCEA, and my guests are Dr. Beverly Hutton of NASSP and Dr. Mark Smylie of the University of Illinois at Chicago. You can participate in our live program if you're watching this via Google+. At the bottom right of the window, click Ask a New Question, and then click Submit, and we'll do our best to answer it during the show. We have a question from the field, and it's from Christina Hesbol saying, thank you for your detailed overview of these new professional leader standards. What recommendations do you have for leadership preparation programs relative to curricular and field-based design so that graduates will demonstrate competency with them?
Mark?
All right.
I mean, I have something to say too, but you're right there in that's your area. What do you intend to do? I mean,
well, let me start the ball rolling. I think there are all kinds of implications here, but I think the less obvious ones are as follows. I think one of the things that these standards do is that they remind us in initial preparation and ongoing professional development of educational leaders that educational leadership is at its core a human enterprise, and that leadership plays out. Its efficaciousness is based on human action and interaction, which means that attention to the human side of leadership and cultivating the capacity of school leaders to function well on the human side as opposed to simply the technical implementation side of practice becomes very, very important. So we think about well, in any of this, we think about what are the demands that the standards make upon a school leader to do the work effectively. And some of those demands include having sufficient social and emotional understanding to develop good relationships with not only students, but adults and members of families and communities, the capacity to develop caring relationships. Communication and interpersonal skills become huge if one thinks about sort of the human interactive side of leadership. The ability to know and understand others authentically, and importantly, I think the ability to learn about and develop oneself in interaction with others. So that's one implication I think that's very important. I mean, there are other things to think about too, that these standards remind us that educational leadership is not agnostic. It's a value-oriented and an ethically derived enterprise, and we might very well help our students and practicing educators or school leaders we work with to think ethically and to be able to manage ethical dilemmas productively. I think one other thing we can say is that in order to bring these standards to life requires a great deal of intellectual and theoretical prowess, if you will, not just in the doing of things, but in the thinking about things, to be able to make situationally appropriate decisions, to be adaptive, to theorize all this with apologies to Chris Argyris and Don Schoen, and indeed to Kenny Rogers and the gambler of knowing when to hold them, fold them, walk away and run, which may be the best lesson that we could give to aspiring educational leaders. So yeah, I think in terms of helping to cultivate the human side of the enterprise, the ethical side of the enterprise, and indeed the intellectual and theoretical side of it. It's just not in the technical doing. It is in the thinking, in the ethics, and in the human relations side. I think
Bev, do you have thoughts on recommendations for prep programs?
Yeah, I was going to refer to standard number 2 that talks about professional norms and ethics and the responsibility to place children at the center of education. Those things, those topics need to be deliberately included in preparation programs. I also think that the preparation programs need more clinical experience and maybe at a different place in the program, as opposed to, I think that a clinical experience needs to be threaded throughout programs so that as you learn things, you get an opportunity to see what they look like and to try them on, if you will, to see, does this fit for me? Because very much of the theory all sounds great and good, and we all can learn that, but when you put it into practice, and as Mark said, humanize things, then you get a chance to see if it really fits and how you fit into that. And how it fits you. So that's the only thing that I would add to that.
Terrific. Wow, thank you. The standards have come some distance since the last refresh, but I was reading in the recent UCEA review, Ed Fuller, Shanika Williams, Angel Nash, and Michelle Young wrote in the winter 2016 review from UCEA that, quote, PSEL is almost completely silent on the need for leaders to be effective communicators, unquote, and that it also, quote, does not mention the inequitable and inadequate distribution of human and fiscal resources that are in districts and schools. Your reaction to these potential missed opportunities?
Well, I think they're both important points. The importance of communication skills is indeed noted in one of the standards. I can't recall which one of them, but it creates a window clearly into that domain of very important aspects of leadership work, which I just spoke to in terms of the interpersonal and communication side of it. And I think that yes, we should pay attention to those sorts of things. I think the ideas of equitable and inequitable distributions of resources could be considered directly under component or standard number 3, but also is if it's implicitly mentioned in the standards and in the components that deal with the effective utilization, allocation, distribution of human, of material, of financial resources. Many ways are captured in, I think it's standard number 9, which speaks to how physical resources, structural resources, financial resources should be distributed in ways that are effective to other domains of work. That would, if you take that down the road far enough, certainly is going to implicate the kinds of ineffective and inequitable distributions that exist, and presumably call for their effect for redistribution so that they're more efficient and more effective. But yeah, I think absolutely those 2 points are crucial. I might quibble a little bit about their absence from the standards. I think a case could be made that
given the fact that Michelle was sitting at the table with us, I can't imagine that they would actually be missing. However, these standards also put schools, school leaders, and school leadership, because these are the standards. These are the gold seal, if you will, the gold standard, if you will. So it almost says, if we are to do a great job of this, these are the things that we need. So it almost puts school leaders in a place to advocate for these things, because if I'm to do this well, these are the things that I need. I would agree with Mark. I mean, maybe we're being a little sensitive since we were co-chairs, but I did not see that being absolutely silent and or missing.
Sure. No, sounds very fair. So we have a few minutes left, and so you did a nice job of talking about what leader prep programs ought to do. Your opinions, maybe Mark, to you on what should scholars do with this, and what kind of research might this spur amongst those that are interested? And for you, Beverly, what should practitioners do? Mark?
Well, there are, of course, lots of good questions that can be pursued to learn more about what makes schools organizationally effective for students and for those who work within them. And there are a number of different paths that we could go down to understand the nature of effective leadership, particularly around change. And I like the idea of exploring more the sort of the human dimension of this. But I think, and this is one of the things we spoke about in the committee, and that is reflected briefly in the introduction to the report, that we should learn a lot more about the enactment and the implementation, the use, and the influence of these standards, professional standards in education, broadly construed, and think about trying to understand them in their relationship to other policy levers as ways that the profession can be developed and supported and indeed improved over time. So I think that might be a very interesting avenue for scholars to think about. Yes, continue to think about how we learn more about the content of standards, but to monitor their use, to begin looking to see how they might have influence, where the limitations might be, what factors contribute or impede the use of professional standards to support and develop a profession, I think could be a very interesting line of scholarship to pursue.
Yeah, very good, very good. And Bev, on the practitioner side, what should practitioners start thinking about?
I would like for principals to look at these standards and the components and see opportunities not only to refine their own professional skills, but to use these standards as a bit of a roadmap to provide some job-embedded opportunities to grow their assistant principals and prepare them for the principalship, building their capacity and strengthening the principal pipeline. Secondly, I would say NASSP supports great leaders in every school who are committed to the success of each student. And given that practitioners had a direct hand in crafting these standards, I want to see these standards not only embraced by every school leader, but adopted by every state, because they represent the gold standard for professional practice. So I challenge principals to prove that.
That's terrific. Beverly, Mark, thank you both for being guests today.
Thank you, John.
Pleasure, my pleasure.
That's our show for today. Cafe UCEA is produced by the University Council for Educational Administration, and Marcy Reedy at the University of Virginia co-produced the show. An archive of this program and the show notes can be found on the UCEA Google Plus page. I'm John Nash at the University of Kentucky. Thanks. We'll see you next time.